How does trauma impact things like addiction, people's recovery from addiction, relapse, all of those kinds of things? I know it's kind of a big question.
Well, it's a very big question, and I will say that the understanding on this is continuing to evolve. For a lot of years, what was considered the mainstream addiction field went the direction of looking at addiction as its own primary disease that kind of developed just because it developed. And so some of this has bias in what is called the genetic model. Some of it is pretty directly influenced by 12 steps. And that's where there's some misunderstanding, because when 12-step recovery came about in the 1930s, it was really seen as a solution to old psychodynamic models, or an alternative to old psychodynamic models, which really weren't getting anywhere with treating addiction or alcoholism. And so a lot of the ethos that followed from the 1930s was really that addiction's a primary disease for which we need a spiritual solution. And then as our understanding of trauma really evolved, people in the addiction field started talking more about trauma, which perked up the ears of a lot of people who clearly saw the connection between addiction and trauma. But there's always been some resistance traditionally, and we still see it in some circles in 12-step recovery and in very traditional treatment centers, saying you're complicating matters by looking too much at trauma, that addiction is its own primary disease that needs addressed. And a lot of that blowback can come from the idea that, gee, when people have been traumatized, that often means someone is responsible, like a dysfunctional family system, or schools, or communities, or governments that send people to war. And it can get a lot easier and much more convenient to say, well, addiction develops just because it's a primary disease. And whenever we bring trauma into the equation, it can make some people uneasy, because yes, there are things like natural disasters and accidents, which are traumas too, that are things nobody can control. But so many of the kinds of traumas we discuss, others have perpetrated on others somehow, sometimes unintentionally, but often intentionally. And so that's where I've really tried to be one of the voices, and I'm not the only one. I certainly did not start this movement of looking more at trauma as a factor in treating addiction. But I would say, especially in the last 20, 30 years, the more we've learned about trauma, there's been more of an outcry saying that we have to address trauma as part of addiction treatment, because so many addictions have their genesis in unhealed trauma. Right. And indeed, even though I am somebody who still works a 12-step program myself, and I believe there's a lot of value to integrating the 12 steps into addiction recovery, I no longer have that opinion that addiction develops just because. That trauma, if it wasn't a direct cause, then it was typically an exacerbating or a complicating factor. And any recovery path from addiction has to look at the role that trauma has played in its development and its progression.
Awesome. So like when we talk addiction, just so everyone watching has a better understanding,
Sure.
like, is this any kind of addiction? Is this alcohol and drugs and food and sex and all that kind of stuff? Anything?
It's a great clarifying question. I'm glad you're asking it, because even the word addiction is falling out of fashion or falling out of favor in some circles clinically, because just to clarify, all addiction means, I think you know this, that I like word origin, that addiction comes from a Latin root, addicere, which means to be assigned to or favoring something. So it's essentially our whole body, mind, spirit system has been surrendered to this thing, fixated on this thing. And that thing can be anything: drugs, alcohol of a chemical variety, can be behaviors like problematic acting out, with sex, with shopping, with eating. And where a lot of these behavioral, or what we call process addictions, can cause some confusion is like with eating, you have to eat in order to survive. With sex addiction, the expectation is not that you cut off having sex altogether, because we're sexual beings. So it's not like drugs and alcohol, where a lot of people's path is to go the route of abstinence, that some of these behavioral addictions can be even trickier to navigate as a result. And some people find it stigmatizing or shaming to call it addiction, and would prefer the term that it's more of a behavioral compulsivity that results from trauma. And indeed, one of the pieces of scholarly work that I've been preparing with one of my colleagues, Adam O'Brien, is really challenging how we've traditionally defined addiction. That the word addiction isn't the problem, it's not a bad word, so to speak, but we've traditionally seen addiction as something that develops just because, and it's chronic, progressive, fatal if left untreated. And Adam and I have really been moving towards putting more of a trauma focus into even how we define addiction. And that addiction more accurately can be defined as an inherent dissociative response. And dissociative is anything our brain does to sever from reality or sever from an overwhelming experience. And that anything that we call addictions, of the examples that I just mentioned for you, really do start as some kind of dissociative response that our brains can get bonded or connected to as a result of traumatic experience.